long before empires carved their names in stone, before sages composed verses under forest canopies, there existed a quiet world nestled between two rivers, the Indus and the now vanished Sarasvati. This land, with its shifting sands and life-giving waters, cradled one of humanity's earliest and most enigmatic civilizations, the Indus Valley civilization. Over 5,000 years ago, long before Rome or Athens, rose the cities of Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Lothal, and others, not chaotic settlements, but marvels of urban planning. Streets cut at right angles, brick homes with private wells, complex drainage systems that outshone many later empires, granaries the size of temples, public baths lined with brick. It was a world of logic, hygiene, and silent grandeur. And yet, we know so little. The people of this ancient civilization left no kings carved in stone, no boastful conquests inscribed on pillars. Their script, etched into tiny seals, painted on pottery, carved into tools, remains undeciphered. Their voices, preserved in clay, but locked from understanding, whisper from the deep past. What language did they speak? What gods did they worship? What dreams filled their minds? What we do know is this: these people lived in harmony with the natural world. They built not to dominate, but to endure. They traded with Mesopotamia, thousands of kilometers away. Their art depicted animals, fertility, and perhaps even meditative figures. A seal showing a horned man surrounded by beasts, maybe the earliest image of a yogi, or even the god Shiva in a primal form. But around 1900 BCE, something changed. The great cities dimmed, trade declined. The once flowing Sarasvati dried into desert. Climate shifts, tectonic upheaval, and economic collapse may have played their parts. Slowly, the people dispersed, not vanished, but transformed. Villages replaced cities. A quiet regression, or a transition, unfolded. And into this transformed land came new voices. Nomadic tribes from the north, riding horses, driving chariots, herding cattle. The Indo-Aryans, descendants of those who once roamed the steppes of Central Asia. They brought with them no stone monuments, no cities of brick, but something even more powerful. A sacred tradition of sound. They sang of gods and cosmos, of fire and sacrifice. These hymns, preserved in perfect oral tradition, would become the Rig Veda, one of the oldest known texts in the world, composed not in ink, but in rhythm, in tone, in the breath and discipline of generations. Through these hymns, the land began to remember its soul in a new language, Sanskrit, and so a fusion began between the settled farmers of the old world and the wandering herders of the new, between the forgotten rivers of the Indus and the eternal flow of the Ganges, between the lost script of Harappa and the spoken poetry of the Vedas. The result was not a destruction, but a birth. The birth of ancient Indian civilization as we know it. This was the Vedic age, a time not of cities and empires, but of rituals under open skies, of fire altars, of memory, a time when the world was seen as sacred rhythm, RTA, a cosmic order that could be felt in the seasons, in the stars, in the very breath of life. And those who preserved this rhythm were not kings, but rishis, seers, who closed their eyes and listened to the heartbeat of the universe. These rishis did not rule with swords. They ruled with sound. Their legacy was not gold, but truth, encoded in mantras, carried in silence, guarded with devotion. As centuries passed, the chants deepened, the rituals grew more complex, society began to take shape, with priests, warriors, merchants, and laborers. The early outlines of caste and duty began to emerge, but still, at the center was the word, spoken, remembered, lived. While other ancient civilizations faded into silence, this one evolved into a civilization of spirit, where history became myth, and myth became a mirror of the self, where the external world was only the gateway to the internal, where the sacred wasn't hidden in temples, but alive in rivers, in fire, in breath. And so it was, under the shadow of the Indus and in the glow of the sacred flame, that India took its first steps, not as a kingdom, not as a religion, but as a vision that still pulses in the chants of priests, the meditation of sages, the prayers of villagers, a vision that dared to ask not only how the world works, but why we are here at all. This was the beginning. This was India, awakening. In the aftermath of the great Indus city's decline, a new dawn rose over the plains of northern India. It was not a dawn of bricks or bronze, but of sacred sound, of syllables passed from breath to breath, never written, yet more enduring than stone. From the open skies and riverbanks came a people, the Indo-Aryans, with no palaces, no temples, but with a fire burning in the center of their world, and hymns on their tongues that would shape the spirit of India for millennia. They were wanderers, pastoralists from the steppes of Central Asia, who crossed mountains and rivers with their cattle, horses, and chariots. Yet more than anything, they carried words, hymns, chants, praises to unseen powers. These would become the Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas, and perhaps the oldest known scripture of humanity. It did not begin as a book, but as an oral current, memorized with precision across generations. The Vedic age was not built on cities, but on memory. And memory here was sacred. At the heart of Vedic life stood Agni, the fire god. Not merely a deity, Agni was the messenger between mortals and the divine. In every sacrifice, from the simplest offering of clarified butter to the grandest royal ritual, fire was lit, and the flames carried hymns skyward. Agni was the mouth of the gods. When the rishis, the Vedic seers, recited their mantras, it was Agni who consumed the words and delivered them to the heavens. But Agni was not alone. The Vedic pantheon was a vivid tapestry of cosmic forces. Indra, the mighty god of storms, who battled the serpent Vritra and released the waters to fertilize the land. He was the most invoked of all, a warrior hero, celebrated for drinking soma, a mysterious divine elixir that lifted consciousness. Varuna, the guardian of RTA, the universal order, watched over truth, oaths, and cosmic justice. Soma itself, both a god and a drink, brought visions and divine ecstasy. These were not distant gods in unreachable heavens. They were forces felt in wind, in rain, in fire, in the breath. Nature and the divine were not separate. They danced together in every ritual, every sunrise, every storm. The Vedic people didn't build temples. Their temple was the open sky. Their altar was the sacred hearth. And their offerings were not gold, but words, precisely chanted, richly metered, vibrating with meaning beyond understanding. These chants were called mantras, drawn from the Sanskrit root man, meaning to think. A mantra was not simply a word. It was thought crystallized into sound. Every syllable carried power. Mispronounce it and the ritual could fail. Sing it rightly and the universe might answer. To be a priest, a Brahmin, was not just to perform ceremonies, but to become a vessel of sound, trained for decades to recite the Vedas perfectly, without error, without forgetting. Society too began to organize around these rituals. The early Vedic age was tribal, egalitarian in some ways, but over time, roles solidified. The Varna system, the early form of caste, emerged. At the top were the Brahmins, the priestly class, guardians of sacred knowledge. Next came the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. Then the Vaishyas, the farmers and traders. And at the base, the Shudras, the servants and laborers. These divisions were not yet rigid, but they set the pattern for a social order that would endure and evolve for centuries. Kingship took on a sacred role. A king was not just a ruler, he was the protector of RTA, the cosmic order. His coronation involved elaborate Vedic rituals, and his legitimacy came not only from might, but from alignment with the divine. A just king ensured prosperity and harmony. A corrupt one invited drought, famine, and chaos. Power and piety were entwined, not in temples, but in fire altars and whispered hymns. As the Vedic tradition deepened, so did its questions. The hymns were no longer just praise. They became inquiry. Who created the world? What was the first cause? One of the most haunting verses from the Rig Veda, the Nasadya Sukta, wonders aloud. Who truly knows? Who can hear declare it? Whence was it born? Whence came this creation? The gods came later than this world's forming. Who then knows whence it first came into being? This was not dogma. It was spiritual wonder. The seeds of Indian philosophy were already stirring beneath the chants. With time, 3 more Vedas joined the Rig Veda. The Yajurveda, detailing ritual formulas, the Samaveda, with musical chants, and the Atharva Veda, with hymns of healing and magic. Together, they formed a vast oral library, not of laws, but of vision. Vision of the cosmos, the soul, the fire, and the eternal breath that binds all. The Vedic people saw existence not as a battle between good and evil, but as a dance between chaos and order, between desire and discipline, between man and the eternal. They lived close to the land, close to the sky, and closer still to the unseen rhythms that pulsed through the universe. And so, long before the temples of stone, before the philosophies of the forest hermits, before the empire and the emperor, there was fire and voice. A civilization built not on conquest, but on sound. A sacred civilization where the word was divine, and to speak rightly was to live in harmony with the stars. This was the Vedic age, a world aflame with vision, echoing with hymns, reaching beyond the visible to touch the eternal. As centuries passed, the fire rituals of the Vedic age burned on. Priests chanted mantras with perfect precision. Offerings were poured in the sacred flames, and the gods were praised in songs as old as memory. Yet beneath the outer form of ritual, something was stirring. A quiet, profound revolution, not in politics or war, but in thought. A new kind of vision began to take shape, not in bustling cities or royal courts, but in forests, among silent sages who turned their gaze inward, beyond fire and sacrifice, into the mystery of the self. These were the Upanishadic seers, thinkers, questioners, rebels of spirit. They were not content with ritual alone. They asked, what lies beyond the gods? Beyond the hymns? What is the nature of the soul? What is real? From these questions was born a body of teachings called the Upanishads. Secret teachings whispered from master to student in the stillness of dawn. They did not reject the Vedas. They completed them, turning the focus from outer ceremony to inner truth. The Upanishads spoke of two great forces, Atman and Brahman. Atman is the inner self, the soul, the silent witness behind our thoughts, emotions, and actions. It is not the ego, not personality, but something deeper, unchanging, eternal. And Brahman? Brahman is the ultimate reality, the cosmic principle, the source of all things. Not a god in human form, but being itself, infinite, formless, beyond names. And then came the most astonishing declaration. Atman is Brahman. The soul within you is not separate from the universe. It is the universe. The drop is the ocean. The seeker is what he seeks. There is no distance between the divine and the human. They are one. This realization, not belief, but realization, was said to liberate one from the cycle of birth and death. And thus emerged one of the most profound quests in human history, the search for moksha, liberation, to break free from samsara, the endless wheel of birth, suffering, death, and rebirth, to dissolve the illusions of separateness, to wake up from the dream of the world. The world, said the seers, is Maya, not unreal, but not what it seems. Like a mirage or a dream, it captivates the senses, but hides the deeper truth. Behind names and forms lies the one, the undivided, the eternal. This was not philosophy in the abstract. It was lived. Forest hermitages became schools of awakening. Masters and disciples gathered beneath trees, not for rituals, but for conversations. One asked, "What is that by knowing which all else is known?" Another replied, "Like clay is the substance of all pots. Brahman is the substance of all things." There was no dogma, only direct experience. No temples, only silence. No conversions, only questions. One of the most famous of these sages was Yajnavalkya, a brilliant and enigmatic figure who challenged priests, kings, and even queens in spiritual debate. When asked by his wife, "What is the true purpose of life?" he answered, "Not for the sake of husband is the husband loved, but for the sake of the self. Everything is loved because the self is within." His teachings revealed the luminous core of Upanishadic thought. All things, even love, point back to the self, and the self points to the infinite. But the Upanishads were not only about abstract metaphysics. They also taught ethics, the importance of self-control, truthfulness, compassion, nonviolence. To realize Brahman was not to escape the world, but to act rightly within it, with awareness, with detachment, with peace. This era gave rise to the sannyasin, the renunciate, who left behind family, wealth, and identity to live in solitude and search for truth. These wandering ascetics walked barefoot through forests and villages, carrying nothing but a begging bowl and a heart open to the divine. They were not escapees. They were seekers, devoted to inner fire rather than outer fame. Slowly, the Upanishadic worldview began to reshape Indian thought. While rituals continued, more and more people turned to jnana, the path of knowledge. This was not intellectual knowledge, but direct realization, often attained through meditation, contemplation, and self-inquiry. One of the most powerful practices that emerged was simply asking, "Who am I?" Strip away the name, the body, the memories. What remains? Not nothing, but a presence, silent, observing, eternal. This presence, said the sages, is Atman, and to know Atman is to awaken from the illusion of separateness. Centuries later, this seed would blossom into entire schools of philosophy, Vedanta, Yoga, Samkhya. But the heart of it was already here, in the rustle of leaves, in the breath of a meditating sage, in the whispered verses of the Chandogya and Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. These teachings would shape not only Hinduism, but also influence the rise of Buddhism and Jainism, and much later, inspire thinkers across the world. From Schopenhauer to Emerson, from Oppenheimer to Aldous Huxley. But more than philosophy, the Upanishads offered a mirror, a way to look within and see something vast and sacred. In a world torn by conflict and desire, they reminded us of stillness. In the noise of prayer and politics, they offered silence. And in the endless search for meaning, they whispered, "You are already that." The fire of the Vedic age still burned, but now it burned inward. The forests had long whispered the truths of the Upanishads, but beyond the shade of banyan trees and the silence of sages, the world was stirring. Fields were being plowed, markets bustled, walls were raised, and the chariot wheels of kings rolled across the plains. This was no longer the age of nomads or lone seekers. A new era was rising, the age of the Mahajanapadas, 16 powerful realms that stretched across the Gangetic heartland, each a growing beacon of culture, politics, and ambition. From Kashi and Kosala to Magadha, Avanti, Vatsa, and beyond. These were no longer tribal confederacies. They were organized states, each with fortified cities, coinage, armies, and complex administration. Some were monarchies, ruled by hereditary kings. Others were republics governed by councils of elders and warriors. But all shared one thing. They were caught in the whirlwind of transformation. At the heart of this transformation stood a question older than swords. How should one rule? Power, the sages had warned, could be like fire, life-giving, but also destructive. And so, from Vedic chants and Upanishadic insight, emerged a new foundation for political and ethical life, Dharma, Dharma was more than law. It was more than duty. It was the moral fabric of the universe, a code of right action that bound kings and commoners, priests and farmers alike. To rule according to Dharma was to uphold cosmic order. To break it was to invite ruin, not just for the ruler, but for the world around him. A just king was seen not merely as a commander, but as a guardian of balance. He offered sacrifices, upheld truth, protected the weak, and ensured the prosperity of his land. A wicked king, greedy or cruel, brought drought, famine, and disorder. Kingdoms didn't fall by sword alone. They collapsed when they turned away from Dharma. And yet, the world of the Mahajanapadas was anything but peaceful. Rivalries burned across the plains. Alliances were forged and broken. Armies marched. And amid the noise of conquest and ambition, a young prince from Kapilavastu walked away from it all. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. Born into royalty, Siddhartha had everything: power, wealth, a family. But when he saw suffering, sickness, old age, and death, something within him shifted. He left his palace, his titles, and wandered barefoot as a seeker, joining ascetics, meditating in forests, questioning every truth he had inherited. After years of searching, beneath a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, he awakened. He became the Buddha, the awakened one. What he taught was both radical and rooted in the deepest streams of Indian thought. Life, he said, is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. To be free, one must let go, not through rituals or bloodlines, but through understanding, discipline, and compassion. He did not speak of Atman or Brahman. He did not speak of gods. He spoke of mind, how it clings, how it fears, how it can be trained. The Eightfold Path was his answer: right view, right action, right livelihood, right mindfulness. A path not just for monks, but for anyone willing to walk in awareness. And people listened, from kings to beggars, from soldiers to merchants. The Buddha's teachings spread like rain over thirsty soil. Monasteries rose, communities formed. A new spiritual map emerged alongside the political one, but he was not alone. Another path, parallel yet distinct, was being forged by Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara of what would become Jainism. Where the Buddha taught moderation, Mahavira preached extreme discipline. Where the Buddha taught detachment, Mahavira demanded ahimsa, total nonviolence, not even harming a blade of grass. His followers, the Jains, would walk with brooms to sweep insects from their path. They believed that the soul could rise only by shedding all karma through self-denial, truth, and purity. So, in the age of kingdoms, two great spiritual fires rose, both rejecting ritual, both challenging caste, both asking the same question: what does it mean to live rightly? Meanwhile, in the halls of kings and the pages of ancient texts, new forms of Dharma were being written, shaped by evolving ideas of society and order. The concept of Varna, once fluid, began to harden. Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, the four social orders, became more rigid. Birth replaced merit. Occupation defined destiny. Over time, the caste system began to calcify, not as dharma, but as dogma. And yet, India remained plural. No single truth dominated. In the villages, rituals continued. In courts, debates raged. In forests, monks meditated. In cities, coins clinked, markets bustled, and stories flowed. These stories of kings and gods, of duty and desire, would soon give birth to the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, tales that were not merely literature, but mirrors of the soul, where Dharma was tested on the battlefield, in the palace, in the heart. As the Mahajanapadas rose and fell, as Dharma became both ideal and institution, as voices of revolution and silence rang from forest to throne, the soul of India was being shaped, not in a single moment, but across centuries, not by one truth, but by many. This was the age when kingdoms flourished, but inner vision still held its throne. This was the age of Dharma, not as a rule, but as a path. In a time of kings and kingdoms, when Dharma was etched into law and caste, when priests chanted verses and warriors marched under banners of conquest, a silent question echoed through the land. Why do we suffer? Amid palaces and temples, few dared to ask it aloud. But in a small kingdom, at the foothills of the Himalayas, a prince was born who would make that question the center of his life. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, born in the Shakya clan, heir to the throne of Kapilavastu. He was raised in luxury and love. His father, King Suddhodana, dreamed that his son would be a great ruler or a great spiritual teacher. To prevent the latter, the king surrounded him with pleasures and hid him from pain. No illness, no old age, no death. Within the palace walls, Siddhartha knew only youth, music, feasting, and beauty. But the truth has a way of finding us. One day, curious and restless, Siddhartha left the palace. What he saw shook his world. First, a man old and bent. Then another, pale and sick. Then a corpse, still and cold. And finally, a wandering monk, serene and barefoot, with nothing yet lacking nothing. Siddhartha returned, but he could not forget. The illusions of luxury had shattered. In the silence of the night, he kissed his sleeping wife and newborn son goodbye, mounted his horse, and rode into the unknown. He gave up his title, his jewels, his name. He became a seeker. He wandered, he fasted, he studied under great teachers, mastering their meditations, yet always feeling the answer still out of reach. He joined ascetics who lived on a grain of rice a day. His body withered, but his spirit burned. Still, he did not awaken. And then, one morning, he stopped under the shade of a Bodhi tree near the village of Uruvela. He sat. He vowed, "I will not rise until I find the truth." Days passed. Temptations came, fear, desire, doubt. They came as visions, as storms in the mind. But Siddhartha remained, still, unshaken. And then, as the moon rose, the silence within him broke open. He saw with eyes unclouded. He saw the wheel of existence, birth, death, rebirth, and what lay beneath it, the causes of suffering, the path beyond it, the illusion of self, the nature of mind. He did not become divine. He awoke. And from that moment, he was the Buddha, the enlightened one. But awakening was only the beginning. For 7 weeks, he sat beneath the tree, watching the world with new eyes. Should he teach? Could others understand what he had seen? Then he remembered, the world suffers, and out of compassion, he rose. His first sermon was in Sarnath, to 5 former companions. He spoke of the 4 noble truths. Life is suffering, dukkha. Suffering arises from craving. There is a way to end suffering. The path is the eightfold path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. It was not a religion. It was a path, clear, logical, testable. It required no gods, no caste, no sacrifice, just awareness, discipline, and insight. And people listened. Farmers, merchants, scholars, beggars, kings and queens, even the untouchables, those condemned by caste, were welcomed. The Buddha accepted all who sought freedom from suffering. He founded the Sangha, a community of monks and nuns, living simply, wandering barefoot, carrying only robes and bowls. His teachings spread, not by conquest, but by compassion. From village to city, forest to palace. He debated Brahmins with humility. He taught in vernacular languages, not sacred Sanskrit, so that all could understand. He asked for no blind faith, only that people observe their own minds. One of his most powerful insights was anatta, the doctrine of non-self. What we call I is a collection of processes, sensations, thoughts, feelings, always changing. There is no fixed soul, no permanent self, just a river of causes and conditions. And clinging to the illusion of self is the root of suffering. To those attached to ritual, he taught ethics. To those addicted to luxury, he taught simplicity. To those mired in despair, he taught hope, not in another world, but in the transformation of this one. He walked the earth for 45 years, teaching, healing, listening. He never claimed divinity. He never claimed monopoly on truth. He said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." His was not a throne of gold, but a cushion under a tree. His voice was gentle, his path direct. And when his final hour came, under the trees of Kushinagar, he lay between 2 sal trees in full bloom. His disciples wept, but he smiled. His final words were not prophecy or command, but simple. All things are impermanent. Strive with diligence. He passed into parinirvana, not heaven, but the peace that lies beyond craving, beyond birth and death. And yet, he lived on, in the monasteries of Nalanda, in the caves of Ajanta, in the chants of monks from Tibet to Thailand, in the silence of meditation halls, in the words of seekers across continents, in every breath taken with awareness, in every step taken with compassion. Siddhartha Gautama, the prince who renounced his crown, who faced suffering not with sword but with insight, gave the world not a god to worship, but a way to awaken. And in doing so, he changed not only India, but the destiny of the human soul. Long before empires rose and crumbled, before gods were sculpted in the temples of stone, there walked barefoot across India a lineage of silent wanderers. They wore no crown, carried no sword, and uttered few words, yet their presence stirred hearts and challenged kingdoms. They were the seekers of total freedom, not just from society, but from the bonds of karma, illusion, and violence itself. Among them, one figure would blaze like a steel flame, Vardhamana, later known as Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara, in a long line of spiritual pathfinders. Like Siddhartha Gautama, he was born into royalty. Like Siddhartha, he gave it all up. But his journey would follow a path even more severe, even more absolute, a path of radical non-violence, or ahimsa. Mahavira was born around 599 BCE in the kingdom of Vajji to a noble Kshatriya family. His youth was filled with comfort, but also with questioning. At the age of 30, he renounced it all: wealth, family, identity. He removed his royal robes, pulled out his hair by the roots, and walked into the forest, naked, alone, determined to master the self and transcend the wheel of rebirth. For 12 years, he practiced the most intense austerities. He fasted until his bones showed. He endured cold, heat, insults, even beatings, without reacting, without resisting. He stood still as insects bit his flesh, believing that to harm even the smallest creature was to harm the soul itself. Because to Mahavira, the soul, or jiva, was sacred. Every living being, from elephant to ant, from bird to tree, was a soul clothed in karma. The goal of life was not to please the gods, but to liberate the soul, to purify it of karma through self-restraint, truthfulness, celibacy, non-possession, and above all, non-violence in thought, word, and action. And so he walked, without possessions, without fear, without anger, and eventually, like the Buddha, he attained Kavala Jnana, perfect knowledge, omniscience. He became the Jina, the conqueror, not a conqueror of lands, but of desire, attachment, and ignorance. From that moment on, he taught, not from temples, but under trees, in courtyards, in silence, and when needed, in words. His followers, the Jains, took up his way with uncompromising devotion. The world, they believed, was not given by gods, but shaped by karma. And karma, unlike in other philosophies, was not merely action. It was a fine, material substance that clung to the soul with every act of greed, anger, deceit, or violence. To be free, one must live with extreme awareness. Even today, Jain monks walk with brooms to sweep insects from their path. They wear cloth over their mouths to avoid inhaling small organisms. They eat only what is freely given, drink only filtered water, and never eat after sunset. Their lives are a practice of constant mindfulness, not in pursuit of comfort, but in reverence for life itself. But Jainism was never only for ascetics. For lay people too, Mahavira gave teachings of honesty in trade, compassion in family life, simplicity in living. Jain merchants became known for their ethics and integrity, their wealth balanced by generosity and detachment. They built schools, libraries, and some of the most breathtaking temples in India, not as places of worship, but as spaces for contemplation. Unlike the Vedic rituals of fire and offerings, Jainism rejected sacrifice. Unlike the Upanishadic search for a universal self, Jainism held a different view, that each soul was eternally individual, luminous, and responsible for its own liberation. There was no creator God, no divine savior, only the path, and the effort one makes upon it. One of the Jainism's most striking contributions to Indian thought is the principle of Anekantavada, the doctrine of multiple viewpoints. Truth, it teaches, is complex and many-sided. No single perspective holds it all. Just as a blind man touching an elephant's leg thinks it's a pillar, and another touching its ear thinks it's a fan, so too do humans grasp only part of the truth. This principle fosters tolerance, humility, and intellectual honesty. In a land of many gods, many paths, and many debates, Jainism offered not just a way to live, but a way to see. By the time of Mahavira's passing, at the age of 72, Jainism had spread across the Gangetic Plain. Monasteries flourished. Philosophical schools debated ethics and logic with unmatched rigor. Jain texts, written in Prakrit and later Sanskrit, compiled vast insights on cosmology, biology, mathematics, and logic, all grounded in non-violence and liberation. But Jainism's influence went beyond religion. It helped shape India's conscience. Later kings, like Ashoka, who turned to Buddhism after witnessing the horrors of war, would embrace the Jain ethic of compassion and ahimsa. Even Gandhi, centuries later, would credit Jainism as one of the spiritual foundations of his philosophy of non-violent resistance. And so, in a world of growing empires and expanding wars, Jainism stood, and still stands, as a gentle, unwavering reminder. Every life matters, not just human life, all life. Every being, seen and unseen, is a soul on its journey. The wheel of Jainism does not turn with conquest, but with renunciation. It does not shout, but it endures. Its temples are silent. Its saints are barefoot. Its legacy is not in armies, but in the courage to do no harm, even in a world that harms without thought. In the stillness of a Jain monk's footsteps, in the whisper of a broom sweeping the path, in the quiet refusal to harm even the smallest creature, we hear a truth older than kingdoms, deeper than dogma. To walk gently is to walk in wisdom. To harm none is to free the soul, and in that freedom lies peace. India, for centuries, had been a land of sages and seekers, of forest wisdom and whispered truths. But now, the winds were shifting. From the banks of the Ganges to the peaks of the Himalayas, a new force emerged: empire. And at the heart of this transformation stood one name: Maurya. Around 321 BCE, in the shadow left by the retreating armies of Alexander the Great, a brilliant and determined man rose from obscurity. He was not born into royalty. He came not with a priest's chant, but with a strategist's mind. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. With the guidance of his legendary advisor, the philosopher and master tactician Chanakya, Chandragupta overthrew the Nanda dynasty and united a fractured land. He built a kingdom that stretched across northern India, from the Indus to the Bay of Bengal, and eventually down toward the Deccan. He became the founder of the Mauryan Empire, India's first great imperial state. Under his reign, Pataliputra, the capital, grew into a marvel of ancient urban planning, with towering walls, bustling markets, gardens, libraries, and a complex system of governance. It was described by Greek ambassador Megasthenes as equal to the great cities of the world. Chandragupta eventually abdicated his throne, becoming a Jain monk and ending his life in meditation and silence. But the empire he founded would soon be inherited by one of the most extraordinary figures in world history, his grandson, Ashoka. When Ashoka came to power around 268 BCE, he was not yet the man the world would remember. Early in his reign, he was fierce, ruthless, determined to expand the empire's reach. His armies were strong, his ambition stronger. And then came the turning point, the Kalinga War. Kalinga was an independent kingdom on the eastern coast. Its people resisted. The battle was brutal. Over 100,000 people died. The rivers ran red. The land mourned, and so did Ashoka, standing amidst the smoking ruins, the cries of widows, and the silence of the dead. Ashoka did not celebrate victory. He was shattered by it. The conquest of Kalinga became the conquest of his own soul. In the aftermath, he laid down the sword and picked up the Dharma. Ashoka embraced Buddhism, but not as mere belief, as policy, as principle, as mission. He became not just a king, but a moral beacon. He began to refer to himself not as emperor, but as Devanampraya, beloved of the gods, and Dharmashoka, Ashoka of the Dharma. He renounced further wars of conquest. Instead, he turned to inner conquest, the conquest of the heart. Ashoka sent envoys across India and beyond, to Sri Lanka, to Central Asia, to the Greek kingdoms of the West, spreading not empire, but the Buddhist message of compassion, tolerance, and peace. He built monasteries, hospitals, wells, roads, and rest stops for travelers and pilgrims. He protected animals, banned unnecessary slaughter, and encouraged ethical treatment of all beings. He created a bureaucracy not only to govern, but to uphold moral responsibility. But perhaps his greatest gift to history were his edicts, messages carved into stone pillars and rock faces across the subcontinent. In Prakrit, the language of the people, Ashoka spoke directly to his subjects. All men are my children. I desire for them welfare and happiness in this world and the next. The greatest conquest is the conquest of the self. One should honor all religions with generosity. These inscriptions, still standing today, are among the earliest and most profound expressions of ethical governance in human history. Ashoka's Buddhism was practical, rooted in compassion, duty, and self-awareness. He did not force conversion. He supported religious diversity, honored Jain monks and Brahmin sages alike, and insisted on dialogue over dogma. But Ashoka's story is not merely one of peace. It is one of transformation, of a king who had the power to dominate the world and chose instead to serve it. His legacy endured far beyond his reign. Buddhist monks, supported by the empire, traveled across Asia. They carried not swords, but scrolls, not armies, but ideas. From India, the Dharma flowed to Sri Lanka, to Burma, to Thailand, China, Korea, and Japan. Temples rose, scriptures were translated. Statues of the Buddha stood in mountain caves and golden halls. And yet, after Ashoka's death in 232 BCE, the Mauryan Empire began to fragment. Without his moral center, the structure faltered. Ambitious successors could not fill his shadow. By 185 BCE, the empire collapsed, but its memory lived on. Ashoka had planted a seed not of domination, but of dharmic kingship. The idea that a ruler's true strength lies in wisdom, in restraint, in justice. His symbol, the Ashoka Chakra, a wheel with 24 spokes, came to represent the eternal cycle of Dharma. Today, it stands at the heart of India's national flag, a testament to a man whose empire of thought outlasted all walls and borders. In a world where empires often rise through blood and fall through pride, Ashoka's story reminds us of another path, where greatness is not in conquest, but in compassion, where a sword, once stained by war, can be sheathed for peace, where a king, once feared, becomes beloved, not just of the gods, but of his people, and where the sound of a monk's footsteps, echoing down an imperial corridor, changes the destiny of a nation. Long before books had pages and libraries had walls, India's soul was carried in songs, not sung in temples, but chanted around village fires, whispered in royal courts, echoed by sages under forest canopies. These were not merely stories, they were epics, vessels of dharma, memory, and identity. They did not belong to any one sect or king. They belonged to the people. And at the heart of this cultural inheritance stood two monumental works, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They were not written in ink. They were breathed into being, passed down from generation to generation through the sacred art of oral storytelling, refined over centuries, and eventually inscribed in Sanskrit by revered sages. Let us begin with the Ramayana, the story of Rama, the righteous prince. Penned by the sage Valmiki, the Ramayana unfolds like a sacred river, flowing through the lives of kings, demons, gods, and ordinary humans alike. It tells of Rama, the ideal man, born into the house of the sun, destined for greatness, yet exiled into the forest for 14 years due to palace intrigues. By his side walks Sita, his devoted wife, and Lakshmana, his loyal brother. Their journey is not just through landscapes, but through tests of dharma, or moral duty. When Sita is kidnapped by the demon king Ravana, Rama's quest becomes a cosmic struggle between righteousness and chaos. He allies with the monkey general Hanuman, builds an army, and crosses the sea to Lanka in a bridge of stone and faith. In the final battle, Ravana falls. Sita is rescued, but even victory carries shadows. Doubts emerge. Sita is asked to prove her purity. Rama, torn between love and royal duty, sends her away. The epic ends not in celebration, but in sorrow, a reminder that even the most noble hearts must endure the weight of dharma. But the Ramayana is more than myth. It is a mirror. In Rama, we see the struggle between personal feeling and public responsibility. In Sita, the strength of love and endurance. In Hanuman, loyalty beyond measure. The Ramayana taught generations what it meant to be a son, a king, a wife, a servant, a human being, walking the fine line between fate and choice. And then, like a thundering monsoon cloud, comes the Mahabharata, the longest epic poem ever composed, attributed to Vyasa, the sage born of a fisherwoman and divine will. If the Ramayana is a hymn to idealism, the Mahabharata is a labyrinth of human nature, complex, chaotic, brutally honest. It tells the story of two rival branches of the Kuru dynasty, the righteous but flawed Pandavas and the ambitious Kauravas. It is a tale of envy, betrayal, love, exile, war, and wisdom. The heart of the epic is the Kurukshetra war, an apocalyptic battle between cousins, fought not just with weapons, but with conscience. And in the stillness before that war begins, upon a chariot drawn between two armies, a warrior lays down his bow. That warrior is Arjuna. His hands tremble, his soul falters. He sees his teachers, his relatives, his friends, all about to die. He asks, what is the point of victory soaked in blood? And then comes the answer, not from a priest, but from his charioteer. That charioteer is Krishna, not merely a god, but a voice of divine clarity. What follows is the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, 700 verses of profound spiritual philosophy. Krishna tells Arjuna, do your duty without attachment to results. The soul doesn't die. Action done with awareness becomes liberation. Surrender to the divine and fear no more. The Gita, nestled within the battlefield of the Mahabharata, became India's spiritual compass, a work that transcends war and speaks to the eternal conflict within every heart. What is right? What is truth? What is self? The Mahabharata does not offer easy answers. Its heroes are flawed. Its villains are sometimes noble. Dharma isn't always clear. And yet, this very ambiguity is its power. It speaks to the human condition, not as we wish it to be, but as it is. Together, these two epics shaped the moral imagination of India. They were not mere literature. They were scripture, theater, education, and ethics, all woven into one. They were sung in homes, acted on stage, painted on temple walls, whispered into children's ears before sleep. Kings shaped their rule around Rama's righteousness. Rebels drew courage from Arjuna's doubt. Farmers prayed to Sita. Merchants idolized Krishna. Hanuman became a symbol of strength. Draupadi, a symbol of resilience. More than anything, these stories lived because they were lived. Each generation found new meanings in their verses. In times of war, the Gita gave purpose. In exile, the Ramayana gave hope. In love and loss, in choice and sacrifice, the epics offered guidance without dogma, wisdom without judgment. They were vast enough to contain gods and demons, yet intimate enough to echo one's own struggles. And they never ended. The Ramayana and Mahabharata were not closed books. They were open rivers, flowing through centuries, adapted, retold, reimagined in hundreds of languages, in poetry, dance, sculpture, television, and film. From Tamil Nadu to Tibet, from Java to Kathmandu, their spirit endured. Even today, a child watching a puppet show, an elder reciting a shloka, a dancer moving through a temple stage, all carry the embers of these ancient fires. Because in these epics, India found not just stories, but itself, its ideals, its contradictions, its longings, its questions. In a world that constantly changes, these eternal epics whisper, truth is a path, not a point. Dharma is a compass, not a map. And life, with all its joy, pain, duty, and freedom, is the greatest story of all. Long after the voices of epic warriors faded and empires rose and fell, India turned inward again, not to escape the world, but to understand it. It was an age not of conquest, but of contemplation, not of swords, but of sutras, sacred threads of knowledge, knotted with reason, intuition, and observation. This was the time of the Gupta Empire, a period many would call India's Golden Age. From the 4th to 6th century CE, under rulers like Chandragupta I, Samudragupta, and Chandragupta II, Vikramaditya, the subcontinent experienced a rare and radiant flourishing of philosophy, science, art, and spiritual insight, while kings ruled with justice, and the economy prospered through trade with Rome and Southeast Asia. A deeper revolution was taking place, one that unfolded not on battlefields, but in monasteries, universities, and ashrams. One of the shining jewels of this age was Nalanda University, founded in the 5th century CE. With its massive libraries, lecture halls, dormitories, and thousands of students from across Asia, Nalanda became one of the world's first great residential learning institutions. Centuries before Oxford or Cambridge, here, Buddhist philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, and mathematics were studied with rigor and reverence. Yet the pursuit of truth in this age was not limited to one school or sect. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism all evolved in parallel, sharpening their arguments, refining their texts, and composing vast sutras, compact, poetic aphorisms that distilled complex systems into powerful, memorable lines. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, synthesized centuries of meditative practices into a step-by-step method of spiritual liberation. Yoga, in this context, was not exercise. It was union of the body, breath, and mind. Through asana, posture, pranayama, breath control, and samadhi, deep absorption, a person could quiet the turbulence of thought and experience the stillness of the soul. At the same time, the field of logic blossomed. Nyaya philosophers constructed detailed frameworks for valid reasoning. They analyzed perception, inference, analogy, and testimony as legitimate sources of knowledge. Their debates weren't mere academic exercises. They were meant to guide seekers toward clarity and liberation. But this age was not only spiritual, it was also scientific. In the court of the Guptas lived a man named Aryabhata, a genius mathematician and astronomer who would forever change the course of human thought. In his treatise, the Aryabhatiya, he proposed that the earth rotated on its axis, explained eclipses without mythology, and calculated the length of a solar year with astonishing precision. Even more revolutionary, he introduced the concept of zero, not as absence, but as a numerical value. This single idea, born in India, became the foundation of modern mathematics. Through decimal systems, algebraic principles, and trigonometric tables, Indian mathematicians laid the groundwork for disciplines that would later travel through the Islamic world into Europe, shaping the very structure of the scientific age. In medicine, the works of Karaka and Sushruta became cornerstones. Karaka Samhita explored the balance of bodily humors, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and emphasized diet, lifestyle, and holistic healing. Sushruta, meanwhile, compiled detailed accounts of surgical procedures, including plastic surgery, cataract removal, and the use of antiseptics. These were not mystical arts, but systematic sciences grounded in observation and practice. Even linguistics, the structure of language itself, became a sacred science. Panini, centuries earlier, had already composed the Ashtadhyayi, a grammatical masterpiece with nearly 4,000 rules that captured the complexity of Sanskrit with mathematical precision. Later thinkers expanded his work, turning language into both logic and poetry. All this unfolded in a culture that saw no division between the sacred and the secular, no conflict between meditation and measurement. To study the stars was to understand the rhythms of Dharma. To understand grammar was to speak the divine word more clearly. Temples and art reflected this unity. Gupta-era sculptures radiated serenity and proportion, whether carved as Vishnu, reclining upon the cosmic serpent, or the Buddha seated in perfect stillness beneath the Bodhi tree. These were not idols of domination. They were icons of inner perfection, bridges between the visible and the invisible. And yet, this age was not without shadows. The seeds of orthodoxy had begun to sprout. The Varna system, once fluid, was becoming more rigid. The lines between castes were drawn with ink that hardened into stone. Women, who had once composed hymns and debated in councils, found their roles increasingly confined to domestic spheres. Philosophical freedom remained alive, but social structures began to tighten. Still, the intellectual fire of the age could not be extinguished. Indian thinkers asked questions that even today remain urgent. What is consciousness? Is the world real or a projection of the mind? Is freedom found in action or in silence? Does the soul remain or dissolve like a dream? They did not always agree, and that was the point. In Indian philosophy, truth was not imposed. It was uncovered through dialogue, debate, and direct experience. This culture of intellectual tolerance, of plural perspectives, gave birth to schools like Vedanta, Samkhya, Vaisheshika, and Mimamsa, each with its own insights, yet all seeking the same light. As the Gupta Empire eventually declined under waves of invasion and internal division, the physical structures faded, but the mental architectures endured. The numbers that Aryabhata calculated now orbit the earth in satellites. The sutras whispered in Nalanda still echo in yoga studios across continents. The questions raised in ancient India have become the foundation of modern science, logic, medicine, and even mindfulness. This was India at her finest, not because she conquered others, but because she conquered confusion, fear, and dogma with clarity, compassion, and curiosity. An age when cycles were not traps, but patterns to be understood. When sutras were not rules, but roadmaps for liberation. And when the search for truth, whether through meditation or mathematics, was the highest form of devotion. The ancient flame of Indian civilization had burned for millennia, a quiet, steady light fueled not only by kings and wars, but by sages, seekers, poets, and pilgrims. From the hymns of the Rig Veda to the insights of Buddha, from the verses of the Gita to the calculations of Aryabhata, India had become a vast, living tapestry of spirit and science, art and argument. But history, like the seasons, turns, and even golden ages must face the dusk. As the Gupta Empire waned in the 6th century CE, India entered a time of fragmentation. No longer unified under a single banner, the subcontinent became a mosaic of smaller kingdoms. Some preserved the old ways, others embraced new ones. The temples still stood, the scholars still debated, but storm clouds loomed on distant horizons. Then came the invasions. From the northwest, through the passes of the Hindu Kush, came wave after wave of outsiders, Hunas, Turkic tribes, and later Islamic dynasties. With them came new languages, new customs, new gods, and sometimes fire. Temples were looted, libraries were burned. The great University of Nalanda, a beacon of knowledge for centuries, was set aflame in the 12th century by invaders under Bakhtiyar Khilji. Thousands of manuscripts, the distilled wisdom of generations, turned to ash in a single night. And yet, even in fire, India endured. For this was not a civilization built only of stone or scroll. It lived in memory, ritual, music, story, in the breath of the people. The Vedas were not lost, for they lived in the voices of priests who still chanted from memory. The Ramayana and Mahabharata were still told in villages by wandering bards and shadow puppeteers. Faith, even under fire, flowed like the Ganges, deep, meandering, and unstoppable. The Bhakti movement rose during this period, a wave of emotional devotion that cut across caste and creed. Saints like Kabir, Mirabai, Tulsidas, and Alvars sang of love for the divine, not through rituals or birthright, but through the heart. They composed poems in local languages, bringing spiritual truths to the common people. Their songs echoed in temples, in markets, in homes, and still echo today. Meanwhile, the teachings of Buddha, though diminished in India, found new life across Asia. In Tibet, Japan, China, and Southeast Asia, his message of compassion and mindfulness blossomed in new forms. Jainism continued to hold firm to its vows of nonviolence, quietly thriving in pockets of devotion and scholarship. In the face of conquest, Indian traditions did not vanish. They transformed. Even Islam, which came with some of the invaders, took on a uniquely Indian flavor in places. The rise of Sufism, with its mystical poetry and emphasis on unity with the divine, found deep resonance in the Indian soul. Saints like Nizamuddin Aulia and Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti drew followers of many backgrounds, creating spiritual bridges where political ones had burned. India became a land of contradictions, where mosques rose beside temples, where Persian verses were sung to Sanskrit melodies, where warriors destroyed and poets healed, where identity fractured and philosophy flourished. And beneath it all, the questions remained. What is the self? What binds us to suffering? What does it mean to live with purpose? Centuries passed, dynasties changed, yet these questions, born in the forests of ancient rishis, continued to echo. Even as colonial powers like the British arrived in later centuries, seeking to define India through foreign lenses, they found a civilization that refused to be caged. Scholars uncovered ancient texts. Philosophers like Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and Rabindranath Tagore began to retell the story of India, not as a relic, but as a living force. And then came Mahatma Gandhi, who reached into the deepest roots of India's past. Jaina Himsa, Vedic self-discipline, Bhakti devotion, and brought forth a weapon stronger than any army, nonviolent resistance. In his spinning wheel, his silence, his salt march, Gandhi distilled 5,000 years of Indian wisdom into a movement that would change not just a nation, but the world. Because the true legacy of ancient India was never just its temples or texts. It was a way of seeing, a vision where truth could be many-sided, where the cosmos was both infinite and intimate, where liberation came not from domination, but from inner awakening. It taught that knowledge was sacred, but so was compassion, that power was fleeting, but dharma eternal, that life was not a straight line, but a cycle, to be understood, not merely escaped. And so, even today, when a mathematician uses zero, they trace a line back to India. When a yogi sits in stillness, they echo Patanjali's breath. When a philosopher ponders consciousness, they walk alongside Shankara and Nagarjuna. When a seeker asks, "Who am I?" they pick up the thread left by the Upanishads, India's ancient wisdom, born of fire and silence, of forest and temple, lives on, not just in monuments or museums, but in the minds and hearts of those who dare to ask, to seek, to listen. It is not a story with an ending. It is a current, a river, a Dong Che Van Min, flowing from the past, through the present, into the soul of humanity.